Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here for this presentation on community standards for soil respiration and other soil atmosphere greenhouse gas flux data. My name is Ben Bon-Lamberty, and with my colleague Stephanie Pennington, who's also on the call, we'd like to talk about this effort we've been leading here that's been funded under the ESS-DIVE Community Partners Program. So at first, I guess the broad topic here is soil respiration, and it's worth understanding a little bit about sort of process and history that led into this work, I think. So soil respiration measurements, it's a very poorly named term. It's practically speaking, what we usually mean when we say this is the surface flux, what we're measuring at the soil surface of CO2 that's coming off. But technically, of course, it is actually the sum of all respiration, in particular autotrophic from plants and heterotrophic from microbes, produced in the soil volume that flows to the atmosphere usually. Really the very first measurements kind of were early in the 20th century. But really, starting in the 1960s, people began to somewhat regularly slap on cuvettes or something onto the surface of the soil and measure over initially very long time periods how much carbon dioxide was evolving in a volume over that time. And then in the 1980s, we had infrared gas analyzers that started really to be used then, and this brought new accuracy and precision and speed. And this made these kind of measurements much more widespread, and it's really become a key measurement in many ecosystem ecology and carbon cycle studies. And both because it's practical and we've realized it's important. It's a very large carbon flux in the Earth, both at the ecosystem scale and then in the Earth system. The figure on the right is sort of a generic carbon cycle slide. Or graphic from originally from Wikipedia actually, but it makes the point that it's really when you add it up, it's probably the second largest flux in the Earth system, carbon flux, after photosynthesis itself. So it has some really strong controls on the evolution of, for instance, our climate system, among other things. And so people have really then this become a key measurement. People have really started measuring this more and more over the last bunch of decades. You can see this is a graph of observations in a database in terms of publications, and to sort of talk about exponential growth. And then in the last 20 years, what really prompted in some parts of this work was that in the last 20 years, we've had automated systems that have begun to vastly increase the amount of data, right? So instead of going out once a month and measuring something and constructing, for instance, an annual budget, these systems are measuring every 30 minutes or 60 minutes or something like that. And this opens big new opportunities, right, to, I think, to understand a lot of fine temporal controls, short-term dynamics, how those scale in space and time, things like hot moments. But this then raises a big data question, which is, there have been individual-driven efforts. Sort of 10 years ago, the SRDB, the Soil Respiration Database, kind of prompted a surge of syntheses and various analyses using it, a collection of like seasonal to annual data. And then more recently, I and colleagues have led some work putting together what's known as COSOR, continuous soil respiration, that as the figure shows, stitches together, makes available in an open science, open data framework, data from a wide variety of sites, these continuous soil respiration measurements from a wide variety of sites around the world, and that's great. These are open data and they've been used, but they're not, but this has been somewhat ad hoc and they're not architected to community standards because there aren't community standards in this area. Unlike, for instance, right, the big contrast would be in things like FluxNet and Ameriflux, where through painstaking, laborious work, the international community has international standards on eddy covariance data. And this has some severe consequences. because you combine no clear standards and no institutionally supported repositories with rapidly growing data volumes, and we know what's going to happen here, right? This contributes to inevitable data loss over time. And in a world with a changing climate, our field observations are essentially not reproducible ever, right? If once we lose them, they are gone because that climate state they were made under will never recur. And the figure on the right shows the sobering figure here is from the Vines et al. Paper a number of years ago, who actually went out and for 500 different papers, tried to contact the authors, tried to get the data, and they concluded about a 17% data loss per year is what we're looking at, which is kind of horrifying. These are publicly funded science data. And so there's a lot of the motivation behind this work, and just making the point here, I guess there's a small sample. This from my colleague Stephanie's one of her surveys that she's been leading about our work. Generally people want to preserve their data and make it accessible for future research. So at this point, then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Stephanie Pennington, who will talk about our work that's been moving all this towards a community standard.
As we work towards a community standard, we want to make sure we put the emphasis on the community part. We did this by researching into existing standards and community engagement. So if we take a step back, this is our overall timeline and how we've approached this. It began in 2019 with COSOR, this continuous soil respiration database, which Ben mentioned. This is where we first started thinking about how raw soil respiration data are received and standardized. But the development didn't begin until we began working with ESS-DIVE community funds in January. And there we've launched a community survey, which I'll talk about later on. We created a draft standard that we've crosswalked our work with existing databases and standards. And looking to the future, we hope to gauge more community feedback by circulating the drafted standards, more phases of the survey, and eventually ending up with a final standard in December that we have community consensus on. This research and community engagement, like we said before, we want the emphasis to be on the community. We want this standard to be practical and usable by the community. We're working on this by having discussions and surveys with the data contributors to COSOR, people at Ameriflux, the other community fund partner PIs, as well as instrument manufacturers. With our community feedback survey, we wanted to engage the broader community and try to get consensus on various topics. We've done this by splitting them into 4 different phases, each with increasing sample size. And the photo to the right is a screenshot of part 1 or phase 1 survey. We began with a sample size of about 30 COSOR collaborators, which were all people who contributed data to the repository, so they were data creators. We wanted to gauge not only feedback about specific variables that are required, but also the structure of the database as well as the survey. We then wanted to move to a more specialized data advisory committee at Ameriflux and to ESS-funded projects, and then to the broader community.
And in between each of these phases, we've continuously adopted new changes to the standard and to the survey itself. And so we create this continuously evolving standard. Next slide. And research into existing standards, we've looked at the structure, best practices, and as well as variables with the most disagreement we found across various networks. And those include large global networks like FluxNet, ISRA, the International Soil Radiocarbon Database, Ameriflux, as well as manufacturers like Lycor and Eosense, and soil respiration specific databases like the SRDB and COSOR. Next.
Oops. So, am I unmuted? Hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. Okay, so then maybe I guess the last part of the talk here is a little bit on some more specifics, like really drill down some specifics. Again, we thought it was useful not to spend 25 minutes going line by line, although we're happy to do that with anyone who would like. So slide, there we go. So yeah, so I guess for this, it's interesting to think about. There are levels, like in any kind of reasonably complicated data product or data standard. There are levels of things from the site where whatever you're measuring is taking place to, say, the instrument, in our case, to chambers, right? So the bottom level is oriented around the actual fluxes and the location and attributes of the chambers that are measuring them. And the instrument, and sort of a mid-level, the instrument or instruments, this is happening at, and then the site. And the one note here, I guess, is that the site part of it is going to be common to everything or most things, right? So Alistair and Kim's work that you'll hear about next, they also probably, right, have to think about sites, a lot of or where this is happening. And so our focus really has been on these lower levels with just enough information, a skeleton amount of information here, but we assume that the soil respiration part is plugged into a larger framework that lets users fully define the site as sort of as that larger framework, whatever that larger framework, however it handles it. So there is, and I'm going to talk in my second to last slide about sort of the philosophy of, do you have a very large amount of required data versus small? And the focus here is much more on a not minimal but focused, I guess, and lightweight standard, in the sense of, our core data is defined pretty narrowly. The things that you absolutely need. This isn't exhaustive, it's more than this, but this gives the flavor, right? The things that you absolutely need to know is what kind of instrument is measuring, where is it, what is the timestamp, the start and the stop. So this is something that, from what I've heard from old war stories, FluxNet and Ameriflux and ICOS, this was a major pain point to work this out, and we were not going to reinvent that particular wheel. So, the actual flux that's being measured, what and how much is being measured, that's your absolutely core part of the data, and that's required here in the standard, in the sense that a record, it doesn't make any sense to have a record without those filled in. And then there's a lot of other stuff that's really nice to have that varies realistically, I guess, from maybe not quite required, but super, super useful to kind of nice. And these include the chamber level data, right? What's the size of the chamber? That's, say, in terms of its footprint, its actual location versus a general location for the site. The errors and model fit statistics on those calculated flux values. So this is not a model where it accepts raw instrument data. We assume that a base level of processing has been done to produce a flux. The environmental conditions when that measurement took place, site level data is, again, really not really part of sort of the soil respiration standard per se, but because it still wouldn't make any sense to have this part without at least a skeleton amount of site level data. And we can look at this really in a little more specifics. And so here, I guess, is what we could have spent the last 20 minutes walking you through line by line. But so we actually, right, so for instance, so here is from that chamber level data, the part of the standard, right? And you're going to have a flux of CO2 that's defined. We define what the sign means. We define that it's numeric or double, say. The units are associated with it, and the fact that it is required. And then with that come a variety of ancillary things, for instance, right, like the standard error on that flux estimate, the computation method, say ambient CO2 conditions when that measurement was made. So again, these are all these largely we judged, and so far our engagement both on the community side and on the sort of other databases manufacturer side, we think is pretty, we've gotten good feedback here. These are nice to have and really useful, but we wouldn't call them required. And so there's an example then of that chamber level data, and there's something comparable but shorter for the instrument level data. So I guess wrapping up, is again, there is this, and one thing again, this 2019 got us thinking about, that is really, we've really benefited then from a lot of discussions with the ESS-DIVE Ameriflux folks, the other PIs, community funds, partners PIs. You know, there is this interesting and inevitable trade-off, right, between the requirements you put on your standard and how much it's going to be adopted or used. I mean, it has to be both usable but also used. And for better or for worse, we've generally focused here on keeping this soil respiration standard focused and lightweight, with a core set of required variables, a larger set of optional variables, a much larger set of optional variables, all to basically either manufacturer or manufacturer conventions, and particularly with an eye towards the existing ESS-DIVE and Ameriflux architectures, assumptions, and that's what that whole crosswalk process was for. And then Stephanie mentioned this, but just it's probably worth pointing out again, is that we really wanted, one thing, the COSOR piece, while not a part of this funded work, was useful, was to repeatedly confront our developing standards with actual data. So not develop, that's the XKCD comic, not sort of develop an abstract standard and toss it out into the world and watch it get torn to shreds by the wolves, but, you know, try a standard out, talk with partners, with folks, community, with this large database of stuff. You see actually in sort of a real world, in a data sense, how well it worked, and keep doing that loop kind of again and again. Thanks. This is the thanks list is actually much longer than this, but there are folks, a bunch of survey respondents, Danielle and Deb have given really critical feedback at a lot of steps. All the data contributors and feedback contributors have been really key as this, and we're looking forward in the second half of 2020 to hopefully wrapping up this standards work and seeing it through. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Ben and Stephanie. This was great. Do we want to just have Alistair go and take all questions at the end? Does that work?
Alistair can answer all our questions, that's fine.
And we have begun recording this, so while we're transitioning, maybe we can take a quick question or two.
Well, I'll see if anyone has any questions that they think of later or would like to take our survey. We'll be sure to include our emails and the survey link in the slides that will be uploaded.
Am I good to go?
Go for it.
Okay, thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks to the ESS-DIVE stakeholders and particularly the domain experts who've called in as well. We really value everybody's input into this. For these kind of efforts to be successful, as Ben and Stephanie outlined, we really have to have a lot of community engagement. So we're thankful for those of you that have joined now and those that will hopefully be watching a recording maybe later. The goal of this standard is similar to Ben and Stephanie, is basically to maximize preservation and reuse of the data And we'd also see this as building a foundation for further development of a leaf level gas exchange standard with the community. And I think one of the things that we have to try and do when you're doing these standards is you have to recognize the compromise between all of the things that we'd like to have in a standard which would maximize its reuse. But we also want to keep the bar to submission low enough so that people will actually submit to the standard and will comply with it. I'm a New Yorker reader, and there's one of my favorite contributors is Atul Gawande, and he wrote this piece maybe a year ago about why doctors hate computers. And in that, the software company coined this phrase, revenge of the ancillaries. And basically, the deal here was that the doctors couldn't be bothered to show up when they were making the software, and all the admins and the ancillaries did. And as a result, the software was horrific for the doctors to use. So I'm glad to see that there's a lot of people here who are going to contribute to that. And I think it's important that we do get this buy-in early on and have people involved in it so that it turns into something that they're going to want to use and they're going to be happy to submit into. The focus of the initial focus of this gas exchange standard is really very simple. It's just on survey level gas exchange data, where you go up and you clip your chamber onto a leaf and take a measurement typically within 90 seconds or so. And then also very commonly measured response curves, CO2 response curves and light response curves. And that's the initial focus. And we recognize that there are lots and lots of intricacies with just those things. But in order to make some progress and tie something off at the end of this initial phase of the project, we've had to go for a smaller focus. But we hope that this will be a foundation for either us or other groups to continue the development of a standard. With that, I'll hand it over to Kim. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alistair. And hello, and my name's Kim Eli. I guess I'll just give a little bit of background on my involvement in this project. I've been working with Alistair for about 5 years ago now, and we've done a lot of gas exchange work together in the field, such as in this title slide here, work up in the North Slope of Alaska. And then I've also been involved in the process of working with that data all the way from collection through to compiling it, processing it, and preparing it for upload to databases. So I kind of have had experience with the whole process and understand from that point of view all the components of the data, and then also have started to think a lot more about this kind of things that we want to include with that data to make it more usable for other people. And yeah, thanks to everyone for joining, and hello in advance to people from Australia and other places that may join us later viewing this video. I'm having a trouble, there we go. So firstly, just a little bit of background on what gas exchange data is for the people who are not already experts. What it tells us is it gives us mechanistic understanding of plant ecosystem fluxes, carbon and water, and it's become really important in parameterizing terrestrial biosphere models. And it's a key component in understanding how plants are going to respond to global change and predicting that. Just the images you see on this slide, there's a cartoon of a cross-section of a leaf showing the leaf cell structure and an open stomata with the gases moving in and out. The center picture is showing quite a large palm leaf with its being clamped inside a measurement cuvette. And the third graph here on the right actually shows some of the challenges that we're facing with getting good prediction of these parameters in models. And here's an example from some work Alistair did some time ago, showing the divergence in how models predict photosynthetic rates. So some of the specific data challenges with gas exchange data is that it's of leaves, is very specialist and time consuming to collect. And so studies usually focus on specific scientific questions which involves limited species and limited geographic areas. So in order for this data to be used again and add value, compiling it has been quite challenging just because of the disparate nature of the data. So what we're hoping with defining a standard is to be able to improve data accessibility and allow people to search for data, filter data, and create synthesis products more simply than is currently available. And then being able to reuse data adds value to that data for both the original generators and can lead to significant advances in our scientific understanding across the community. So just repeating again what Alistair said about the scope of this particular effort, we're looking at measurements made on leaves with portable gas exchange instruments, and we're looking at specific types of measurements as listed here, with the survey, dark respiration, some response curves, and the parameters typically derived from those response curves like VCmax and Jmax. We recognise that there's a really large scope to expand this, and probably there will be a lot of call within the community to do that for other types of measurements such as fluorescence. So now I'm just going to run through a little bit the process that we've gone through to get to where we are with the standard development. So recently there's been greater call for people to archive their data in public data archives. And these archives often have standards for high-level metadata, but they do not have standards for getting right down into the detail of particular types of measurements, such as gas exchange. With regards to large databases that do contain gas exchange data, there are a few available, but they tend to only include quite limited number of variables. However, we have looked at those as including how they label and define the variables as a starting point for some of our work. There's a real difficulty in reusing data without appropriate metadata and sometimes without providing the raw data. You need to know more about a measurement of VCmax than just the number. You want to know the environment it was measured in, the types of plants, the technique for measurement, and various other things. We've also encountered some inconsistent terminology in the literature with variables such as what do you call respiration and what does that mean, and the use of terms such as A and Amax and ASAT. So as we started to put together what was already existing out there, this kind of started to define the structure of our standard. So we looked for common terminology, and this included what we found in data archives, databases, and synthesis data sets, and also outputs of instruments. And so this led to defining variables. And by this, we made variable names as like short field names that could be used in a data table and be machine readable, standardizing units, and having a good definition of what that variable meant. The next piece was we've worked a lot with thinking about what sort of metadata are going to be most useful to enable data reuse. And this is where the balance comes in between getting as much as possible, which might be of interest, but also making the standard usable and not too much of a burden for a data contributor. And so to enable this, as well as coming up with metadata fields, we've also come up with vocabulary lists to enable systems to be put in place to whatever database might take up this standard to be able to allow data entry to be done in sort of like checkboxes rather than people having to reinvent their own terms and descriptors. And an element that we've also talked about a fair bit as being kind of the ultimate future-proofing for data reuse is inclusion of raw data in public archives. We feel that in developing this standard, we can't predict all possible reuses of data, and things in the future might change as different types of inputs might be required to make calculations. So we feel this would be a useful addition. So now I'm actually going to run through the components of the standard. And again, as Ben mentioned, I'm not going to run down all the detailed lists of the different fields, but I'm going to walk through the way the standard is currently structured in a Google Doc to enable people who have further interest in looking at this and reviewing to kind of give you an orientation of where you might find the different parts. So after a few instructional and overview sheets, the first part of the actual standard itself is defining the measurement types. So here we've listed those measurement types of survey, ACI curve, etc., written a definition, and also some suggestions for details that could be used in the metadata. Then the second component is the detailed metadata for methods. Here we have focused on specific metadata for gas exchange measurements, and the more general metadata for any sort of scientific study about locations and authorships, that is not being covered here, as particularly for ESS-DIVE, that is specifically being covered by other standards that are being developed. And then any other data archive system will probably have their own standards for those sorts of general metadata. The next component is a list of all the variables that are required for different measurement types. And this includes like the names of the variables and definitions and units. Then the final component for submission of processed data is contained in this required variables field. And that shows the required variables for different types of measurements. And the last part of the Google Sheet is a walk between different output from different instruments and where they have common measurements, just so people can perhaps use that to translate the output of their instrument to these commonly accepted variables. So the first part of reviewing this standard will take you to an instructions sheet in the Google Sheet. And that contains basically some directions on what we would like reviewers to do, and also links to other files related to this. Secondly, there's an overview, and that explains the scope of the standard and then also summarizes the content of each of the rest of these components to sort of a roadmap, if you like, of the standard. Now, the first actual component of where we've started to make definitions is the measurement types. So this part defines each measurement type and then lists the types of things that for the protocols used for those measurements that should be included in the methods metadata. The next component is the metadata component itself. Here we have lists of different types of metadata covering experimental conditions, such as were the plants naturally grown? Were they grown in chambers? Were there any manipulations with atmosphere, fertilizers, and so on. There are elements that deal with sampling methods and elements that deal with specific sample information, such as plant and leaf age. As far as review of this, this component of the standard, there are two options here. So there's the table, which is in the Google Doc, or I've also produced put it into a survey style form, and I feel that that's possibly more digestible for the reader. The table is pretty dense with all the standardized vocabularies listed there. The next part is a guide to submitting additional metadata. This is going to be really variable depending on the particular experiment. But it's a guide on how to include metadata, say about specific codes that might be included in your data sheets for species or plot definitions, or describing your instruments, including information such as like instrument calibrations. So this is more of a suggestive part of the standard to give people ideas on the types of things that, or the way that different types of metadata could be included and presented. But its use will vary highly depending on the experiment at hand. So this part, the variable definitions, is a list of instrument outputs, calculated parameters, and constants that would typically be included in this type of data. So there are three obvious components to this: variable names, units, and the description. This required variables is an attempt to think about covariates that make each of these types of data particularly useful. So what we've done here is, for each data type, listed a minimum list of variables that should be included in a data table. And obviously people are most welcome to include as many variables as they like. We're just trying to indicate a minimum requirement here. And then the last component is this crosswalk between the different instrument translations or instrument outputs and translating the standard instrument output variable field names back to our standardized variable names. This is not meant to be indicating that people relabel variables for their submitted raw data, but it's just there to be a tool to enable data uploaders to map their instrument output to the correct variable name, and also for data users in the future to synthesize raw data files if they. Okay, so just to summarize those different components, we have some just introductory how to understand the standard sections, the measurement types definition, metadata requirements, supplemental metadata guidelines, variable definitions, required variables for specific data types, and a translation tool for instrument output. The highlighted in green sections are really the core of the submitted data that would be required, along with the raw data, and all the other non-coloured parts of this table are essentially supporting information and definitions. So, of course, we would love everyone's feedback and contribution to this. And feedback's welcome on all sort of aspects of this, the standard, from the content and the structure and the explanatory components. We're asking people to provide feedback by making comments in that document, in the standard document that you were just seeing screenshots of in Google Sheets. And there's also the survey form for the methods metadata. If these methods aren't accessible to you, please feel free to email me. Just to quickly through where we've got to in our process of developing this standard. Obviously, we've finished the background research. We've had an initial round of review within our group at Brookhaven Lab, where there's a group of people all doing gas exchange, and they've come from different backgrounds and labs. So that was a really useful first round where we implemented quite a few changes. Now we're inviting the broader community to review, including the ESS-DIVE community fund partners. So the plan going forward with this standard is not only to have it ready for ESS-DIVE by the end of this year, but it's to publish a description of the standard. And we've got a manuscript in preparation, and it's to be submitted to Ecological Informatics. They have a special issue on long-tail data types coming up, and it's coming up soon. The manuscript deadline is the 31st of August. And we're inviting anyone that would like to contribute to giving us feedback on the standard to co-author on that manuscript. So just some more on feedback opportunities. Alistair and I are going to host some just open meetings. We're calling them virtual cafes at the end of this week. We've set up 3 different meeting times that should cover a wide range of time zones. The links to these meetings are included in this document here, linked to as the author list. And that's also a place where people can enter their contact details and be included as authors on the paper. So we're asking for first round of feedback by next week, if possible. We really want to get moving on this fast. The actual standard, all details will not be needed to be finalised by the submission of the paper, but we'd like to get the most of the details in place by then. We'll be consulting other co-authors for final review of the paper around the 24th to 26th of August. And looking forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alistair and Kim. That was really great. So why don't we just open the floor up to any questions people have for either Ben or for Kim, and Ben, Stephanie, Alistair, and Kim.
I have a question for Alistair and Kim. Do I have the floor? Is that okay? Okay. So I really like, I super like the future proofing, keep the raw data around. How, like, it seems like that opens you up to supporting like any format of any manufacturer. I mean, what's the trade-off, or I guess how is that implemented? I don't know. It seems like that's seems like that could be a huge technical lift, although I really see I love the idea.
Kim, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think our initial aim at that would be literally uploading raw files. So not converting to any particular formats, preferably, with the high level quality control done, like obvious input errors and whatever corrected, but yeah, no translation, just this is what the machine outputted. And then the actual data would be in a separate table, or like the data for the publication or the process data would be in a separate data table that sort of stood alone.
Okay. So you're not, in a sense, the standard just provides space for it. It doesn't take any responsibility for that, that run.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of stems from things like if people put up VCMax 25 data, right? You want to know how they got to VCMax 25, what kinetic constants did they use, what was the leaf temperature of the measurement, things like this. And then there's additional information that people need when they try to do synthesis activities that the original people may not have thought about, but will be buried in those raw data files. So the idea is just to provide a space for that raw data so that your data submission could just be simply have a checkbox type idea where it says raw data is associated with this entry, so that if someone is doing a sophisticated synthesis, they could then go back and get that. And then, the idea there is with the raw data is that, the headers for those instrument outputs would be reasonably well described, but they wouldn't have to conform to a standard.
Cool. Thank you. That's a great idea.
I was just going to follow up on that. Just to confirm what you said, Alistair, you were saying that if you load raw data, I mean, one of the challenges with the Meriflux that I think Ben brought up was, while each tower site has data, the way that the PIs present the data isn't always the same. But you just said something, I think, which would solve this problem, which is each manufacturer might have different labels for a similar variable, but the person uploading the file provides that translation code. So basically, what the manufacturer calls like photosynthesis or assimilation or whatever, you say that maps onto this standard variable that you've laid out, so that in the future, programmatically or machine code can figure out what variables in a data file it would want and grab them no matter what it's called based on the manufacturer's original label. Did I understand that right?
I think you're close. What we don't want to do is make it very burdensome for someone to upload their raw data file. So we'd like to just have that parked somewhere. One of the things on the standard that this the last sheet that Kim talked about was this kind of translation, and that obviously translates instrument output that we've seen right now. But I mean, manufacturers are putting out new instruments and they're changing the way they label columns and things like that. So I don't think we're going to be able to future-proof that. But it was really about can we make a space for someone to park raw data so that somebody, if they really need to do a deep dive for their analysis, they know where to find the raw data and they don't have to go and find that graduate student who's no longer in science, who's maybe got it on a zip drive somewhere. I mean, it's basically just protecting the data, that raw data, and we're not trying to make that raw data itself searchable, but just to let somebody who was looking for the data know that it's an option to go and rummage around in there. That's the idea at the moment, but if we hear a lot of input from people, they want that searchable, that's something we can look into. And as you know, many of the manufacturers do not make machine readable headers for their data columns as well, which complicates this.
Anyone else?
Yeah, Alistair, this is Paul. When you talk about raw data, I assume you don't really mean true raw data. You mean data that are in the raw form, but that the user has determined are acceptable data, meaning there wasn't something wrong with the calibration, there wasn't some issue.
So yeah, we're not talking about, when we say raw data, we mean the instrument output. So what the data file that would come off the instrument. So obviously, if you've got a mosquito in your chamber and you logged it, then you would delete that data. But
okay, but you would not expect that data to be in the raw data file. You'd expect the user to eliminate some things that should be eliminated.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I had a question related to that. Would there be a way of quality controlling once the data are uploaded? Like, is there a way to flag, say, negative CI values or columns that got out of order or something like that, so to immediately see these data are not correct? Would that be possible, or are you just trusting all the uploaders to have fully quality control everything, and whoever works with the data set has to deal with it?
sorry, I'll take this first and then hand it over, Kim. Martijn, I think the idea with the raw data upload is that we just want somewhere where you can park that data so that if someone really does want...
Not so much for the raw data per se, but also when you enter the other data.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky to think about a QA/QC because for different people it's going to mean different things. Certainly, we're not saying that there's going to be a rigorous QA/QC on raw data that would accompany sort of processed or massaged data, if you like. But the idea is that what we're asking for is if you give your VC Max data, for example, you're also going to give us A, CI, and T-leaf, so that if somebody wanted to go and check, like, that looks a bit weird, let me just have a look at the way they fitted that data, it would be possible to do it. Or if they wanted to refit it themselves using their own approach, they could do that as well. I don't know if you have any more to add to that, Kim.
Probably just that I think the data QA/QC, aside from having defined vocabulary for some like metadata upload, probably the QA/QC of numbers is out of the scope of what we're doing here. It would come down to more how that could be done on a database to database kind of level, and probably, yeah, beyond just the data archive kind of level.
Yeah, I can also jump in. This is Charu from ESS-DIVE. And so it is our intent that once these standards are there as part of implementing in our system down the lane, we start to write parsers for each of these standards. So if someone swapped the different columns, we could give immediate feedback that the format of the file was not submitted. But it's not checking the data itself, it's more checking the format and whether it's complying with the standard that we are adopted. So that is sort of plans down the lane. We don't yet have projects funded for that, but we're hoping to use some of our community funds if we receive it towards that purpose.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we're at time. We could take one quick last question and with that, and then we'll wrap it up.
This is Lisa. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I have a question for sort of both sets. One is, have you considered images to go with your files here? So certainly for soil respiration, a picture of where you're taking the images and what the vegetation around it looks like might be useful for people who want to use that data later. And then the same is kind of true for leaf gas exchange. Sometimes an image can tell you a lot that the data don't necessarily tell you. And I didn't see area in your columns either, and so maybe I missed that, but just whether or not that leaf is filling the chamber can make a huge difference in the accuracy of gas exchange.
I'll go first, Ben.
Sure, just I guess, and briefly, thanks, Lisa. That's something that we've seen done. We haven't to date the photo part of it. We haven't really considered it, maybe because we're not imaginative enough thinkers. So, you know, that'll be an interesting, thanks for the suggestion, I guess, basically, you know, that'll be an interesting point of discussion for us to consider. It's great feedback.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, if you see a picture of a really damaged leaf, that tells you a lot about what you want to think about the data. So that is a good idea. We do have a section on leaf area, and we consider, you know, one-sided leaf area, geometric leaf area, partial leaf area, how you calculated leaf area. So it should be in there somewhere. Kim could probably tell you where.
Great, that sounds like a good thing for us to chew on in our next meeting. Thanks, everybody, and thanks to the presenters. It was really great to get see the progress on these standards. And the links are in the chat window. I will send a follow-up email with the links to both these surveys. For those of you who are interested, please do respond. We do want a lot of people from the community providing feedback. So with that, I do want to put in a plug. We have our next webinar on August 20th. This is going to be about the water quality, sample-based water quality measurements, as well as hydrological monitoring for discharge. And so we'll have Amy Goldman from P&L and Kristen Boy from SLAC presenting on their standards as our next August webinar. So thanks, and see everyone next month.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.